Jimmy Stewart hung up the phone. His finger had dialed the 7th number, heard it ring 3 times, heard the sleepy voice of an old woman say hello, and then he'd frozen completely. He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but listen to Mrs. Peterson ask, "Hello? Is anyone there?" Until finally, like a coward, he'd placed the receiver back on its cradle. Now he sat in his Beverly Hills study at 3:47 a.m., staring at the silent telephone like it was a loaded gun. The rotary dial still showed traces of where his sweaty finger had touched the numbers. Harold Peterson's mother had been right there, 9 years after her son died in a burning bomber over Germany, and Jimmy Stewart had hung up on her without saying a word. The house creaked around him, settling into the cool California night. His wife slept peacefully upstairs, unaware that her husband was downstairs wrestling with ghosts. The successful movie star, the beloved American icon, sat alone in his study like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, because in many ways he was. To understand why Jimmy Stewart was sitting there at 3 in the morning, afraid to make a phone call, you have to understand what happened in the skies over Germany 9 years earlier. You have to understand the decision that saved his life and cost his best friend everything. Lieutenant James Stewart was leading his squadron of B-24 Liberators on what should have been a routine bombing mission. It was February 1944, and the war was grinding on with no clear end in sight. Jimmy had been flying missions for months, and the stress was beginning to show on all of them. These young men, barely out of their 20s, were carrying responsibilities that would break most people. But what you didn't know about that day in February was that Jimmy Stewart was sick. Nothing dramatic, just a fever and chills that had been building for 2 days. The flight surgeon had cleared him to fly, but Jimmy knew he wasn't at his best. His hands were shaky, his concentration wasn't sharp, and he'd been fighting nausea since breakfast. Harold Peterson, his co-pilot and closest friend in the squadron, noticed immediately. Hank was one of those guys everybody loved instantly. Farm boy from Minnesota, wheat-colored hair, smile that could light up a room. He had a girl back home named Sarah, a schoolteacher with brown eyes, and he carried her picture everywhere. Jimmy had heard him talk about the farm they were going to buy after the war, the kids they wanted to have. "We're going to have 4 kids," Hank would say during their long talks in the barracks. 2 boys, 2 girls. He had it all planned out, down to the names and the color they'd paint the farmhouse. "Jimmy, you look like hell," Hank said as they were suiting up for the mission. "Maybe you should sit this one out." Jimmy caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror of the equipment locker. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold February morning. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his flight jacket. He'd barely kept down his breakfast, and the thought of climbing into a bomber and flying for 6 hours made his stomach churn. "I'm fine," Jimmy insisted, but even saying the words made him feel dizzy. The lie tasted bitter in his mouth. "No, you're not." Hank put his hand on Jimmy's shoulder, and Jimmy could feel the steadiness of his friend through that simple touch. "Look, I've been flying co-pilot for 6 months. I can handle the left seat today. You take the right side, get some rest." Jimmy's pride screamed at him to refuse. Squadron leaders didn't take the co-pilot seat because they felt a little under the weather, but his body was telling him something different. His vision was slightly blurry, his reaction times were off, and deep down he knew that flying in this condition was dangerous not just for him, but for his entire crew. It was against regulations, but it happened sometimes when pilots were under the weather. The squadron leader would switch positions for a mission. Jimmy hesitated, looking at Hank's eager face, seeing the excitement barely contained beneath his friend's calm exterior. Hank had been itching for a chance to prove himself as a pilot, and Jimmy knew he was more than capable. "You sure you're ready for this?" Jimmy asked, hating the weakness in his own voice. Hank grinned that Minnesota farm boy grin, the one that made you believe everything was going to be okay. "Been ready for months. Besides, what could go wrong?" And that's how Harold Peterson ended up in the pilot's seat of Sweet Dreams, Jimmy Stewart's B-24, on February 20th, 1944. The mission started normally. 24 bombers heading east toward Nuremberg, their engines droning in formation. The weather was clear, visibility good, but Jimmy tried to rest in the co-pilot seat, feeling something was wrong. Not with the plane, but with the decision he'd made. He kept glancing at Hank, wanting to take back the controls. Then the Messerschmitts came out of the sun. The attack was sudden and vicious. German fighters diving down from 12,000 feet, machine guns blazing. The formation scattered as pilots tried to evade the attack. Jimmy's training kicked in, and he started calling out directions, but Hank was already reacting, banking hard left to avoid a fighter coming in from 2 o'clock. "Good move," Jimmy shouted over the engine noise. "Now climb, climb, but the German pilots were experienced. They herded the bombers like wolves with sheep, separating them from the formation, picking them off one by one. Sweet Dreams was holding her own until the second wave of fighters came in. That's when everything went wrong. Jimmy saw the Messerschmitt diving toward them from above, guns already firing, tracer bullets streaming past the cockpit. "Hard right," Jimmy yelled. Hank pulled the yoke, but he was a split second too slow, or maybe Jimmy's call was a split second too late. Either way, the Germans' bullets found their mark. The starboard engine exploded in flames, and the bomber lurched violently to the right. "We're hit," Hank shouted, fighting to control the aircraft. Jimmy reached for his controls, but Hank waved him off. I got it. The plane was losing altitude fast. The right wing was on fire, and hydraulic fluid was spraying across the windscreen. They had maybe 3 minutes before the wing burned through and the bomber broke apart. "We need to bail out," Jimmy said. "Ring the bell, get the boys ready." Hank hit the alarm, and through the intercom they could hear the crew preparing to abandon the aircraft. But when Jimmy looked at his altimeter, his blood went cold. They were at 8,000 feet and falling fast. Too low for a safe jump, especially with German fighters still in the area. "Hank, we're too low. We need to crash land this thing." Hank looked at the altimeter, then at the burning wing, then at Jimmy. For just a moment, that confident farm boy expression wavered, and Jimmy saw the scared kid underneath. But here's the thing nobody ever talked about, the detail that Jimmy Stewart never shared with any reporter or biographer. In that moment, when Hank looked scared, Jimmy made a decision. He could have taken back the controls. He could have pushed his sick, exhausted body to its limits and tried to save them all, but he didn't. He let Hank try to land the plane because he was afraid that in his weakened condition, he'd make things worse. "You can do this," Jimmy told his friend. "Find us a field, any field." Hank nodded, gripped the yoke tighter, and started looking for a place to land a crippled bomber. Through the windscreen, they could see farmland below, fields and trees and small roads cutting through the German countryside. There, Jimmy pointed to a clear stretch of ground. That field, straight ahead. Hank lined up the approach, fighting the damaged controls every inch of the way. The bomber was shaking apart around them, pieces of the burning wing breaking off and tumbling past the cockpit windows. They almost made it. They were 50 feet off the ground when the wing finally gave way. The bomber rolled hard to the right and smashed into the earth at 200 miles per hour. The impact was like hitting a concrete wall. Everything went black. Jimmy woke up 3 days later in a German field hospital. Broken ribs, concussion, burns on his hands and face, but he was alive. The German doctor who treated him spoke broken English. "Your friend," the doctor said. "The pilot. He did not survive the impact. I am sorry." Jimmy closed his eyes and didn't open them for 12 hours. The rest of the crew had bailed out successfully and were captured. 3 of them survived the war. 1 died in a POW camp. But Hank Peterson, the Minnesota farm boy who was going to buy a farm and marry a girl named Sarah, died on impact because Jimmy Stewart had been too sick and too scared to take back the controls. That was 9 years ago. Now Jimmy was sitting in his comfortable Beverly Hills home, staring at Hank's parents' phone number, trying to work up the courage to make a call he should have made 8 years earlier. But this wasn't the first time he'd tried. In 1946, he'd written a letter, 17 different versions, each one sounding more hollow than the last. How do you explain to grieving parents that their son died because you were too sick to do your job? The letter had never been sent. In 1949, Jimmy had driven to Minneapolis, found the Peterson family's address, and parked outside their house for 3 hours. He'd watched Hank's mother hang laundry, a small gray-haired woman moving slowly. When she looked up and noticed the stranger in the expensive automobile, Jimmy had panicked and driven away. But here's what made this even worse. He'd learned that Hank's father had died of a heart attack 6 months after receiving the telegram about his son. The local doctor said it was his heart, but everyone knew better. Harold Peterson Sr. had survived the Depression, raised 3 sons and lost 2 of them before his own heart simply stopped beating. Jimmy had their new address. He'd even driven by the house once, a small bungalow on a tree-lined street, sat in his car for 20 minutes, and then driven away without knocking on the door. What was he supposed to say? That he was sorry. That if he'd been a better pilot, a stronger man, their son would still be alive. The truth was, Jimmy Stewart had been living with survivor's guilt for almost a decade, and it was eating him alive. Every standing ovation, every magazine cover, every fan letter felt like a mockery. He was being celebrated for being a war hero, while the real hero, the kid who'd tried to save them all, was rotting in a grave in Germany. That's why he couldn't sleep. That's why he wandered his house at 3 in the morning like a ghost. That's why he'd picked up the phone book tonight and found the courage to look up the number. But now what? What do you say to a grieving mother at 3 in the morning? Hi, Mrs. Peterson. You don't know me, but I'm the reason your son is dead. Jimmy's hand moved closer to the telephone. The rotary dial seemed to mock him in the lamplight. All he had to do was dial 7 numbers, and he could finally unburden himself of the secret that was killing him slowly. He thought about what he would say. Mrs. Peterson, this is James Stewart. I'm calling about your son Harold. And then what? How do you tell a mother that her son died because you were too weak to fly? He started to dial. His finger found the first number, the second. The rotary mechanism clicked in whirred. 3 numbers, 4, 5, 6. Mrs. Peterson was probably asleep, and Jimmy could picture her, gray-haired and fragile, jolted awake by a telephone ringing in the dark. His finger hesitated over the last digit. Once he completed this call, there would be no going back. But then he stopped, because suddenly he could hear Hank's voice as clear as if his friend was sitting right there in the room with him. Besides, what could go wrong? That's what Hank had said the morning he died. That's what Jimmy had been hearing in his dreams for 9 years. And now, sitting there in the dark, Jimmy realized something that hit him like a physical blow. The realization came slowly, like dawn breaking over the mountains. Hank had volunteered to fly that mission. He'd seen that Jimmy was sick, and he'd stepped up because that's what friends do. He hadn't been forced into the pilot's seat. He'd chosen it. And if Jimmy called Hank's mother now, if he told her the truth about what happened, he wouldn't be easing his own guilt. He'd be destroying a mother's memory of her son's heroism, because Hank had been a hero. He'd tried to save his crew, tried to land a burning bomber, died trying to do the impossible. If Jimmy told Mrs. Peterson that her son had only been in the pilot's seat because Jimmy was too weak to fly, it would taint that heroism forever. Jimmy's hand fell away from the telephone. He sat back in his chair, suddenly understanding something he'd been too consumed by guilt to see. He wasn't honoring Hank's memory by carrying this guilt around like a cross. He was dishonoring it. Hank had made a choice to be brave, and Jimmy was making that choice meaningless by taking responsibility for it. But understanding something and living with it are two different things. Jimmy Stewart would continue to have sleepless nights. He would continue to carry the weight of that February day in 1944. But he wouldn't make that phone call. He wouldn't burden a grieving mother with his guilt. Instead, he would honor his friend in a different way. He would try to be worthy of the life Hank had helped save. He would try to be the man Hank had believed he was when he'd offered to take the controls that morning. Jimmy Stewart closed the phone book and turned off the desk lamp. He sat there in the dark for a few more minutes, thinking about farms in Minnesota and girls named Sarah and the price of survival. The house around him felt different now, less like a tomb and more like a sanctuary. When he stood up, Jimmy felt something he hadn't experienced in 9 years. Peace, not the complete absence of guilt, that would never fully disappear, but acceptance. He understood now that carrying Hank's memory wasn't about punishing himself. It was about making sure his friend's sacrifice meant something. He climbed back into bed next to his sleeping wife, and for the first time in 9 years, when he closed his eyes, the dreams that came weren't nightmares. They were memories of a young man with wheat-colored hair and a farm boy grin, who'd volunteered to fly into hell because his friend was sick and someone had to take his place. In the months that followed, Jimmy Stewart would change. He would be kinder to his fellow actors, more patient with demanding directors, more generous with charitable causes. He would think of Hank Peterson before making decisions, and late at night, when sleep eluded him, Jimmy would sit in his study and talk to Hank Peterson's memory, not seeking forgiveness, but offering gratitude for the extra years, for the life he'd been allowed to live. The telephone never rang that night. Harold Peterson's mother would never know that Jimmy Stewart had spent 3 hours staring at her phone number, wanting to apologize for being alive while her son was dead. She would never know that Hollywood's biggest star considered himself a coward who'd let a better man take his place in death. But she would also never have her memories of her son's courage tainted by someone else's guilt. She would go to her grave believing that her boy had died a hero, trying to save his crew. And in the end, maybe that was worth more than any confession Jimmy Stewart could have made, because the truth was complicated. But heroism, real heroism, was simple. It was a farm boy from Minnesota seeing that his friend was sick and saying, "I got it, I got it." It was trying to land a burning bomber because someone had to try. It was dying while attempting the impossible because that's what brave men do. Jimmy Stewart would carry that truth for the rest of his life, not as a burden but as a responsibility, to be worthy of the gift Harold Peterson had given him, to honor the memory of a friend who'd been braver than he'd ever known. And sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet and the ghosts came calling, Jimmy would sit in his study and talk to Hank Peterson's memory, not seeking forgiveness but offering gratitude for the extra years, for the life he'd been allowed to live, for the chance to be better than the man who'd been too sick to fly on February 20th. The phone book went back on the shelf, and the telephone stayed silent. Some conversations, Jimmy Stewart finally understood, were better left unspoken. Some truths were too heavy for the living to bear, and some heroes deserved to stay heroes, untainted by the guilt of those they'd saved. Have you ever carried a secret so heavy it felt like it might crush you? Have you ever wondered if telling the truth would heal you or just spread the pain to others? Jimmy Stewart wrestled with these questions for most of his life, and maybe there's no perfect answer. Maybe sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is carry your burdens alone, so others don't have to share the weight. What would you have done in Jimmy's position that night? Would you have made the call? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of courage, sacrifice, and the complex choices that define us all. Thank you for watching.